I am not a King James Version onlyist. You don't need to be a King James Version onlyist in order to argue for some of these passages that are often taken out, removed, or omitted, whichever word you want to say, from our modern English Bibles. I think John 5:4, right, just to get everything out of the way, and it's not just John 5:4, it's the second part of John 5:3. I think we should keep those. We shouldn't relegate them off to any margins or push them out of the text altogether. And of course, as you know, I'm a Byzantine priority guy, not a KJV only guy. When decisions are tough and very, very difficult in the textual critical world, I tend to side with the Byzantine text, just straight up. That's how it is. So that's exactly what I'm going to do here with 1 John 5:4. But you didn't come here just to hear my presupposition up front. That's just so you know that my where my biases are. But you came to see the work, as it were, right? You know, when you're in math and you have to show all your work to the teacher. Nobody wants to see that except the teacher. None of the students care. I don't even really care to do it, but you just have to. But here, I enjoy doing the work, and it looks like most of you enjoy seeing that work. So that's that's what you're here for. So I am going to argue. I'm going to argue for its inclusion, but based mostly off my presupposition of a Byzantine priority position. I struggled with this one. You know what? There comes a time when you're putting your stuff together that you just gotta be like, okay, I got what I got, and this is what we got. So I feel a little bit like that. That's what it's like today. It was way more than I totally anticipated. Not just because of verse 4, but this variant, as most of you probably are aware, is it's not just verse 4. It's also the end of verse 3. So I have it up here. We're gonna read a little bit more because I think the context is pretty important on this one. I know I've seen a lot of people say that you can't understand verse 7 unless verse 4 is there, and we'll ask that question as well. Excuse me. So our passage here is John 5:4, and I'll be reading from the New King James Version. And so from the top here, it says, "After this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now there was in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool, which is called in Hebrew Bethesda, having 5 porches." Now, some of you might get this reference, but I just, whenever I think of Bethesda, I think that this man who's laying there, unable to move, he's probably like not able to move because half his body is like stuck inside the stone of the stairs. If you get that reference, shout out. Anyway, having 5 porches. In these lay a great multitude of sick people, blind, lame, paralyzed, waiting for the moving of the water. So this is variant 5:3b. Okay, so this is the first part, and it's separated. It's such a weird variant. It's like the verse numbers are totally inconvenient here. They get right in the middle of this variant. And then our passage, "For an angel went down at a certain time into the pool and stirred up the water. Then whoever stepped in first after the stirring of the water was made well of whatever disease he had." Now, I had a pastor when I was new in the faith. He would call him the angel jacuzzi. So you get the picture. Now, a certain man was there who had an infirmity 38 years. And when Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had already been in that condition a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be made well?" And the sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no man to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up. But while I am coming, another steps down before me." And Jesus said to him, "Rise, take up your bed and walk." And immediately he was made well. All right. So the question is, right, we come back to verse 4. It's the entire verse, the whole thing about the angel stirring up the waters and curing diseases. And then in verse 3, the second part here, we have the people blind, lame, paralyzed, and then waiting for the moving of the water. So typically what we would see here is most of our modern Bible translations, which don't have these verses in there, are going to put a full stop here instead of a comma and go right down to verse 5. Now, a certain man there had been infirmity 38 years. With the comma there, it just kind of eases in nicely to the rest of this passage. Now, it's interesting because sometimes in some variants you'll hear some criticism like, interrupts the flow of the passage, or it interrupts the flow of the thought. But in this instance, it seems like, and again, this is extremely subjective. Okay, I understand that, but it doesn't appear to really interrupt the flow. It really seems to make sense of what's going on. Now, when you come down to verse 7, and this is all pertinent, right? The sick man answered and said, I have no man to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up. Now, the question is, does this statement make sense if verse 4 is not there? So if we don't have the bit about the angel in the water, or let's take it a step further. Most of the ancient I don't like using that term. A lot of the older witnesses, right? Aleph, B, C, D. Or I don't know if D is in there. I have to check. Well, we'll check the numbers afterwards. But we'll take this out. So there's nothing to be said about waiting for the only time we ever hear about water, right, is from verse 1 when it says that everyone was near the pool of Bethesda. So if we take this passage out and we read it, in these lay a great multitude of sick people, blind, lame, paralyzed. Now a certain man was there who had an infirmity of 38 years, and when Jesus had saw him there, knew that he had already been in that condition a long time, he said, do you want to be made well? And the sick man answered, Sir, I have no man to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up, but while I am coming, another steps down before me. Now, if verse 4 wasn't there, how we would likely read it, okay, and I'm just assuming it's not there, okay, I think it is, but just assuming that it wasn't there, how would we understand this? In your exegesis, you might pull up some details in a historical search about the Pool of Bethesda. Now, I'm not going into the historical details of the stirring of the water and some of the stuff that archaeologically has surrounded that. I want to look specifically at the evidence, but if we were to, the external evidence, the manuscripts, and maybe take a look at some of the context here. If you don't have those verses and you come to this, you will see that somehow by going into this pool of water, when it is stirred up, it has a healing effect on the individual. And if we were exegeting this without verse 4, we would probably just say, oh, that's interesting. We don't know how that works, but Jesus is going to come and do something, and of course you'd go on your way there. But it is interesting because verse 4 does apparently answer the question as to what it is about the stirring up of the water that made it desirable for people to go in to receive a healing. Now, the other thing that needs to be said here, I think, is how do I phrase this? Now that Michael Heiser's stuff has come out, right? People are a little bit more open to the supernatural stuff. So the other way to kind of phrase to look at this is from the perspective of a supernatural thing happening clearly, right? If verse 3b and 4 are to be in existence, if they're there, right? If they're authentic scripture, then we would have no choice but to see this as an actual event that occurred. That an angel, some sort of heavenly creature, would come down and would do something to the water to make it so that people can get healed. That's a very supernatural thing. I just think about it like if you were to go to a place today where they have this pool of water and people would step in random moments, like the water would start to do stuff, and then somebody would jump in, they would get healed, right? It would be like miraculous, like spiritually miraculous, right? And so that's kind of what we're seeing here. It looks to be some sort of spiritual thing that's happening, that's causing the pool of the water to, or I don't even know how that would work. Maybe it's the angel doing the healing, or maybe it's the water being stirred up. Again, if we're looking at this as authentic scripture, this would be a very supernatural event. I won't try to understand how it works, but with that being said, I think one way that could potentially lead us to a place where this could be taken out would be this sort of reservation when it comes to supernatural things. Now, I don't want to, I'm not specifically blaming anybody or anything like that, but just if we're looking at internal reasons why, or external reasons why this passage could be removed, is perhaps somebody doesn't particularly like the way that this reads and the implications that appear to be taken from it. Like, for example, an angel can heal, an angel can stir up the water and heal. But I don't think that's necessarily the best way to come to a variant like this, is to have this sort of preconceived idea of what can happen supernaturally and what can't. I mean, you take a look at some of the weird supernatural stuff you read in the Old Testament, and then the question you would have is, well, does this supernatural stuff, does it stop at the New Testament? And of course, the answer is no, right? We see demoniacs, right? People who are possessed by demons. In the early church, there was healings that were happening. God used certain individuals to heal people all over the Old Testament. Perhaps God is using this angel to heal people in much the same way that he used them. Anyway, so all that to say generally is I wouldn't take a fear of the supernatural as a reason to remove this verse, although it's understandable as to why somebody might want to take this verse out. We are going to take a look at a paper that's rather interesting in its conclusion, and there's a couple we'll just say inconsistencies in Gordon Fee's writings that I'll point out, which kind of goes toward this point. Let's pop in Metzger. Let me just make sure I'm showing you here. I'm going to make this nice and big. But yeah, so 5:4. So verse 4, he says, is a gloss whose secondary character is clear from its absence from the earliest and best witnesses. P66, P75, Aleph, B, C, D, W, 33, the Italian DLQ, the true text of the Latin Vulgate. The true text of the Latin Vulgate. This is why the Vulgate was so annoying to me. So he's saying it's not in the true text of the Latin Vulgate. So what he's saying there is that there are other versions of the Vulgate, right? There are other copies of the Vulgate which have this in it, and they're not the true Vulgate. See, and this is what the Naber, when we were taking a look at that, what it reminded me of. Like, it's really just a rewording of so this variant for the most part is in the Clementine Vulgate and the Stuttgart Vulgate. I'm not sure which Vulgate manuscripts don't contain it. I didn't do a lot of digging into into the Vulgate, but it was such a mess trying to deal with just the way that people had been putting it in specific apparati. Anyway. So he goes on to share all the witnesses, Latin Vulgate, Syriac C, Coptic, Sahidic, Bohairic manuscripts. I'm not sure what this is, Act 2. The Georgian and Nonus. I think Nonus is a church father. I've not heard of this one before. And then, so one, he says it's absence from the earliest and best witnesses. Again, there's that phrase. I don't particularly like the phrase early and best witnesses. There we go. Number 2, the presence of asterisks or oboli to mark the words as spurious in more than 20 Greek witnesses. They must be later because, I only seen like 4 or 5. I mentioned this earlier. So S, lambda, pi, 047, 1079, 2174. And then 3, the presence of non-Johannine words or expressions. There really is only one expression that I think we could consider non-Johannine. And it's more of a grammatical case. I was going to do a search earlier, and I'll probably do this a bit later. But I spent a lot of time on the Johannine words thing. So they're suggesting that katekateron is, from time to time, suggesting that is not a Johannine way of saying things. Emveno, that is of going into the water, is not him. Ekdekome, katekome, kinesis, teraki, and nosimi. These are not, John doesn't use these words. So we know because John doesn't use these words. And he notes that the last 3 words, kinesis, teraki, and nosimi, don't appear in the New Testament or they in any other place, that these are hapax. Hapax legomenon, a fancy word saying these words only appear once in the entire New Testament. So the last 3 words only here in the New Testament. And 4, so his 4th reasoning, is the rather wide diversity of variant forms in which the verse was transmitted. See footnotes 6 to 10 on page 338 of the text volume for variant readings within verse 4. Since the passage is lacking in the earlier and better witnesses, which normally assists in identifying types of text, it is sometimes difficult to make decisions among alternative readings. On the whole, however, the committee gave preference to the readings that are supported by what was regarded as a preponderant weight of attestation, or that seemed best to account for the origin of the other readings. All right, so that's Metzger there. A few things that just really irked me. Again, the true text of the Latin Vulgate. What is he saying there? What is he saying there? He's saying there that he has done all the text critical work on the Vulgate, and he has come to the conclusion of what the true text of the Vulgate is. I think that's a bit of a stretch. Earliest and best witnesses. Again, not too big on that. The presence of asterisks or oboli. Yes. So I wanted to show you Codex Pi. But it was only available on INTF, and so when something's only available on INTF, I can't show it live here because I probably break in some copyrights or something. But indeed, it does have very obvious decorations surrounding this specific passage, and it's indicated that it's suggested that these passages shouldn't be in the scripture. I don't know if that's the case. I think in these instances, all it's doing is showing that that this is a place where it doesn't appear anywhere else. This textual variant is split in. If we're looking at external data specifically, the external data I think is split like right down the middle. And what do I mean by that is this. So let's say P66 and P75. We'll just kind of grant that for the time being. Aleph, B, C, D, T, W, they all don't contain the passages. Then there's a couple Latin manuscripts, D, F, L, Q. The Vulgate Stuttgart, I think, doesn't contain it. And the Syriac Seratonian doesn't contain it. The Coptic Sahidic doesn't contain it. Part of the Bohairic doesn't contain it, but part of the Bohairic does contain it. You go back into what's included. And again, I'm just assuming verse 4. I know there's some question about the second part of verse 3. But again, there's plenty of unsealed support for the inclusion. It's A. Codex C has a corrector on it, which had put it back in. Codex E, Codex F, Codex G, Codex H, L, Delta, P. And this is all ranging from 5th century to the 10th century. I think there's even a few 12th century minuscules in this listing. The Byzantine text supports it. The majority text supports it. Again, you come down to the Latin. There were some Latin that didn't support it, and I'm talking Old Latin. But then there are Latin that does support it. So A, AUR, B, C, E, F, F2, J, R1. And again, these are like 5th century, 6th century manuscripts. Again, the Syriac, remember the Seratonian didn't contain it. But then the Philoxenian, the Heraclean, the Palestinian do contain it. We have the other part of the Bohairic manuscripts, the Coptic manuscripts, which contain it in Egypt, by the way. And then the Vulgate, the Clementine edition, contains it. So this is split right down the middle. So with this being split right down the middle, I would be inclined just to roll with what the church had preserved down through the rest of the ages, and seeing as the Byzantine text contains the passage, and that's what was essentially propagated through the ages, I would be inclined to go with that reading. That's what has been preserved. I mean, that's you don't see a large number of manuscripts later on in church history that don't contain the passage. Tertullian writes this. He says, "Why have I referred to such matters? So that no one should think it over difficult for God's holy angel to be present to set waters in motion for man's salvation, when an unholy angel of the evil one often does business with the same element with a view to man's perdition. If it is thought strange that an angel should do things to waters, there has already occurred a precedent of that which is to be." And of course, the precedent of that which is to be, he's referring back to John 5:4 very clearly. Interesting how he in this passage, Tertullian seems to be suggesting that, if you're having difficulty with this idea of angels doing things to waters, listen, John 5:4 is the passage. Okay, he does it there, and not only does he refer to it in John 5:4, he really seems to refer to it as authoritative in the 200s. Without any indication that it was missing from any manuscript that he might have seen. So Yeah, that's a very interesting quote. And Chrysostom in the 400s in the Greek tradition, so Tertullian's in the Latin tradition. Chrysostom in the 400s refers to it, though I don't have the quote here. Yeah, so going back to Gordon Fee's article, let me see if I have the name. Did I at least put the name? Yeah, the Evangelical Quarterly article. So he does this whole article where he talks about the unique words and the specific Greek constructions and how they don't appear to be joining, and he goes into some of the depths, and then he finishes the article concluding that we don't have to worry about it being in part of the scripture, and this is Gordon Fee's take on it. But then he adds under a heading called a theological postscript, and he makes it clear that this is not part of his argumentation, but it is interesting because I think what it does is it really undoes all of his arguments that this text could not have been removed because someone didn't like what it says. He does argue that in the specific article, and so this is what he says: a theological postscript. So listen up. I won't show it just because I don't know if I can, but all right. So here, there is a kind of capriciousness to grace that allows only one person to be healed, and only the first one into the pool at that. It is no surprise that the invalid whom Jesus cured had lain there 38 years. His condition was such that he could never have been the first one into the pool. One wonders how this can be grace that loads all the advantages towards the one who is least sick and thus most able to jump into the pool, while month after month, year after year, those who need it most lose hope for ever being made whole. One can gladly affirm that such an account is no part of the inspired original. Now, I don't know about you, but it's almost funny. I mean, the state of the man who laid there sick for 38 years is not funny. But what is funny is that this is the kind of reasoning that somebody would go through and then think, you know what, it's better just to remove this. I don't like how it portrays the grace of God in the angel, so let's take it out. So in this article in which he shares the reasons for why this passage would be removed, he goes and then kind of concludes that there really isn't one. He then goes on in this theological postscript to give us a theological reason about why he finds it okay that this passage isn't scripture. Which could also be why someone might find it okay to remove this passage. Now, some people might view it as unfair that this man laid there for 38 years and didn't have the opportunity to go in there. But then, I mean, you take this and you put this into real life scenarios, and it's interesting from Gordon Fee because he's a continuationist. Now, I'm a continuationist. I believe that God heals and all that. But he's got kind of like the same thing going on when you consider that there are people, even in continuationist circles, who have remained sick for years and years and years and years and years, and yet the Lord has not healed them. We wouldn't conclude based off that that's terrible grace from God and that we should expound these scriptures that explain the healing nature, the gifts of healing, like in 1 Corinthians 12. Anyway, I just, to conclude this article with this theological postscript was rather interesting, and I found it to be totally pointing in the opposite direction, almost undoing much of the stuff that he had written in this very same article. Anyway, that's so far where I am with John 5:4, what is it? John 5:3b to 4. I believe we should retain that as scripture. Again, I'm coming from a Byzantine priority perspective. The textual external data is essentially half and half. I think there's been a few more discoveries and stuff since Metzger wrote his commentary, since the 80s when Fee had done his. And again, this whole idea of it being not having any early manuscript support from the East, when there really isn't any manuscript support from the East for much of the New Testament, again, depending how you define early. yeah, I don't see any reason to relegate this to the footnotes, or to remove it altogether. It should remain in our Bibles. Now, James Snapp had an interesting. This is where you come in, Brother James. Had an interesting theory. I'll share it. I'm not sure where I stand with his idea, but it's certainly worth sharing. I should have the article here. So here's James on this one. I know he won't mind me sharing his work. So this is the text of the Gospels. Okay, come here. I'll put a link in there. You can read his whole article later. He goes into a lot more detail than I did here, even though I have been on here for more than 2 hours. Okay, so he says, this is his interesting theory. As he says, I am willing to posit that an anomaly in the autograph of the Gospel of John itself elicited different treatments of John 5:3b-4. Picture John reading chapter 5 to his listeners from the autograph for the very first time without 5:3b-4. Inevitably, somebody would ask John, why were the sick, blind, lame, and paralyzed people waiting near the pool instead of swimming in its water? And I can imagine that John added an explanatory note in the margin, waiting for the moving of the waters. And then someone asked, what agitated the pool's water? And John realized that his listeners in Ephesus were oblivious to the background of the pool of Bethesda, added another note, and thus verse 4 came into existence as a second marginal note. When John died, the autograph was entrusted to the Christian community at Ephesus, and they treated the annotations in 3 different ways in the next generation. In the ancestor of Byzantine manuscript, the notes were either blended into the main text, as John 21 has been. That's an interesting discussion there. Or else copies just the way they appeared in the autograph, in the margin with symbols to connect them to John 5:3-5. In the ancestor of Alexandrian manuscripts receiving the text of the autograph slightly later, being in Egypt, not Ephesus, the notes were assumed to have originated with someone other than John and were therefore not considered worthy to be included in either the main text or in the margin. Another consideration might have been in play in the mind of the early Alexandrian scribes who decided not to include verse 4, a desire to protect John from the charge of promoting superstition. Now, somebody in the comments asked about superstition. A scribe who thought he knew that water in the pool of Bethesda was agitated by entirely natural forces could easily persuade himself that the marginal note in his exemplar stating that an angel of the Lord bathed in the pool of Bethesda could not have been written by an inspired author. In addition, he did not wish to appear to commend Asclepions. I'm sure I mispronounced that wrong. But this Asclepions, I don't know, has to do with I believe a pagan god who involved healing people through baths, public baths, involving snake statues and stuff like that. Again, I don't have all the details, but there's a really interesting video. If I ever find it, I'll share it again. Someone popped it on a comment on one of my Facebook posts in the Textus Receptus group, I think. And then he goes on to say, the testimony of Pi and its relatives, which have John 5:4 with the asterisks, commends family Pi as an excellent representative of the autograph of the text of the Gospels. The form of verse 4 that appears in Codex Pi is the form which should be adopted instead of the readings found in the majority of the manuscripts. And that's the angel of the Lord, I think, is the big bit there. All right. So that's James's idea. He thinks possibly that John may have put in a gloss explaining why he was at the pool of Bethesda, and then another gloss to explain what was happening. So I will leave you with that for John 3b to 4.